Okay, let's get into the weekend's action. We're going to start with the matches that did transpire. A little different format for tonight's show, and we'll talk about it as we get there. But big weekend here, full slate of matches. Everybody played, all 10 fixtures on the screen. Paul, there were a few really high-profile matches. Obviously, Manchester City getting drubbed by Arsenal was one of them. Liverpool, Bournemouth, probably more of a surprise marquee matchup of the match weekend of the fixtures. And then Everton just continuing to throttle. And I don't know who says more about Forest or Brighton. Why don't we start? I think we'd be remiss not to start with a 7-0 drubbing by a team that we all question would be able to score when the season started. So Forest 7, Brighton 0. The proverbial question, Paul, more about Forest, more about Brighton's issues.
Oh, I think it's the steal the Jamie quote. That's a tough one. I think it's a little bit of everything. And I think when we look at this, to me, I like the entire time I was watching this match, I just had the Jordan meme popping up where like, and I took that personally. Like clearly they did not like what happened to Bournemouth. And so if I'm a manager and I see this, like, could you ask for more of a response from your side? Like, would you get drilled, 6-0 versus another rival on the table? I thought the response was great. I thought Brighton looked woeful. I think when you look on the year, they have they have a negative XG when you look at their versus XG, which you would never think from a Brighton side. They're always so positive. So it is very clear that there's something that fundamentally is broken and not working offensively for this side. Not to take anything away from Forest, but I think Brighton's been that poor and that when I look at the quality in that side, I don't know if there's a more disappointing side in the league from when we looked at like the beginning of the season, looked at quality and where we expected them to be. I'm not sure there's a more disappointing side. Maybe you could say City, but they're in terms of what we expected out of Brighton, this is not the Brighton side we're used to seeing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think they probably are the most disappointing side. I think for some people, that really believe Palace was going to be like a team that pushed for Europe, maybe just for how poor they started, but they've almost turned that around and righted that ship, which is, and it kind of makes sense. You turn over players, you finally get an influx of a little bit more talent, which means you need guys to bet in. You lose your best player in Elise, and then you also, maybe your second best player or maybe your second most influential player down the stretch of last year and a player you were planning to build this season's campaign around, and Adam Wharton really went off the boil and is just now starting to get back to some of that high level form he showed last year and over the summer with England. So, I don't disagree. Brighton was pretty woeful. I will say you got to give a lot of credit to Forest, to your point. Give credit to the players, give credit to Nuno for getting that team to respond. They're still very tricky to play against, obviously. What more can you say other than Chris Wood? Alanga with a hat trick of assists. You got Nico Williams getting everybody's getting in on this thing. They are having fun, and they're almost taking the piss out of everyone who was like, oh, give them till Christmas and they'll be, out of Europe.
Yeah.
It'd take a pretty big collapse at this point in a lot of ways, and a couple other teams going on big, strong runs for them to fall out of at least guaranteed Europa League spots, top 6. But I think they have a legitimate shot to fight for the top 5 and potentially make it into the Champions League. Let's look at
we talk about how like the bottom 3 are like dropping out, right? We're getting the same 3 relegated. Like the one thing that's nice about this is to see like it does feel good and sound good to hear about Forest being back in Europe, right? Like, I mean, it feels like old blood again there. So
I think the idea that you have Forest, Bournemouth, and Villa all fighting for European places, and Newcastle fighting for European places, and hearing names like Chelsea and City are really going to have to put their, results together to get there, and that United and Tottenham are ultimately at a point where they need to win the Europa League to qualify for Europe next year, because neither one of them is really going to have a chance of getting into the European places. I think it's a good sign for the Premier League. I think it's also a sign of what is changing in the Premier League and why it's so hard for a club like United and Spurs, who have ultimately gotten it wrong for a few years in a row. So let's talk here quickly about United. 2-0 loss, another howler from Onana. How much longer can the manager stick with this keeper, or is the backup just as unreliable that he probably just goes with the guy who costs more money, maybe even just so maybe he catches form and you can sell him for a little easier come the summer?
Yeah, this feels like a case of like sticking with the keeper to regain his confidence and get some sort of value out of him. Like you don't want to go to the shopping window with the keeper on consecutive howlers and then ask for like 35 million for him, right? Like so you're hoping to justify what you want to ask for him, but at this point you're almost like, do you just take that loss? Like I don't know what the answer is there. I don't know what the backup looks like, but yeah, it's a spot. I think with Manchester United, like when Warren came in and basically said this is the worst United side that they've ever seen, like when you do something like that and you take a page out of the Mourinho book a little bit there, like I feel like you really, really run a risk. You run a risk of either like you either have to know what you're doing and you hope that you're setting the right fire and the right butt and that things fall into place, or you have a risk of you risk ruining the entire like locker room and losing the entire side. And I feel like we saw a little bit of a response, but I feel like more we're seeing him losing this locker room. Maybe that's a good thing because there's enough pieces that need to leave it, and maybe that's part of the plan. And like he doesn't really care. But
I was kind of wondering if that was that part of that thing was like, let's see which players take offense to this and show up tomorrow and work harder in training.
yeah,
And let's see which players basically do this to me in the canteen. And everyone who does this, you know, transfer committee, you can just cross their name right off the list. Like
yeah,
you can find the red tag in your locker. And we'll talk a little bit later about some players there and some movement and whether or not it'll change. So let's jump across the city. We'll go to the blue side of Manchester. They traveled down to Arsenal, though I think all 15 of the city supporters might question whether or not any of the actual first team 11 actually traveled for this match. So they lose it 5-1. I did the watch along with Glenn, the Brentford fan. And I got to be honest, it wasn't an impressive performance by any means from Arsenal. I actually thought they were quite bland at times, and City almost made it really easy on them, especially the second half goals where it looked like once it went to 3-1, City just completely quit, which is just crazy to me to think a team with City's firepower. Um, but I got to ask you, like, it's a huge match whether or not City was still considered in their mind still in the title race or not. We've had them written off for a while, but I don't think you can manage or play that way. How in the goddamn Christ is a fully fit Kevin De Bruyne not starting this match?
I mean, it just suggests what we've kind of wondered all along. She just doesn't have it anymore, right? Like, I mean, we've seen it in spurts, but we've also seen it for not nearly the extended period of time we wanted to see it before he was back down with an injury. I think we'd see a matcher here where he'd pop up and be relevant. But listen, there's a reason that this side is struggling, and there's a reason they went out and bought Nico Gonzalez for like 50 million today, right? I mean, he's a central defensive midfielder coming out of Porto. Like, there's a reason they went and got that kid. We know what this side looks like. We've known for 2 years that the key part of this is Rodri and what happens when he's not there. But the fact of the matter is like they just need help all around. It's the midfield. I mean, they never really replaced Mahrez, which is why they went out and got Marmouche. And like they've had these big transfers come in and not clip together. But like the bottom line is, there's nothing really threading that defense and holding it together with that front line. And we knew that like when they bought Holland, it was all going to run through him to some extent and they just haven't had the pieces to be able to run that through them and then be good enough defensively. And we saw that. And like I think the big difference for me is when I saw the City side, I thought honestly, I thought the Arsenal City game was dreadful. Like if you were watching it, it was not good football.
Oh, I know. I did 2 hours of talking about everything but that match.
And then when you get into this, like I think the thing that really like was glaringly different to me with this City side is you saw a City side that went down and didn't really care. Like they didn't seem like they really were that interested.
Yeah.
When they went down by 2, it was almost like they just mailed it in, which you just never would have seen before from that side.
Yeah, at 3-1, I thought, I mean, when they scored the goal to make it 1-1, I'm like, oh, it's a game again. Here comes
Mhm.
City, because they were on the front foot for a little bit.
Mhm.
Then to give up such a cheap goal, I mean, to such a dirtbag, and Thomas Partey taking that goal. And I'm sorry, Arsenal fans, you can root for any player that they put in the jersey, and I would too, but you don't have to sing a player's name doesn't belong to be out of a federal jail cell in your country. So like really think about like taking the class road next time. But let's take a look at the table. You mentioned the European angle here and kind of the interesting piece. Chelsea wins today. They jump in to fourth place. City's in fifth, followed Newcastle, Bournemouth, Villa, all within 4 points. And of course, Newcastle tied on both goal difference and overall points. So it's just goals scored separating the two sides. I've asked you this before. Um, I'm pretty confident Liverpool and Arsenal are both qualifying for top four at this point. Almost even starting to feel like it probably will finish 1-2 in some order there, with Liverpool most likely on top. Um, Chelsea, City, which of those two would you think has the biggest chance of falling out of the top five? And which of the bottom of the next three do you think has the best chance of getting into it?
I gotta tell you, man, I don't like Chelsea or City, either one of those teams to finish there. Like I think if you're looking at this, I think Newcastle and Bournemouth have been in better form than both Chelsea and City. Like I liked Newcastle before this last weekend. I like them to get in there, but I think you look at Newcastle, Bournemouth, what they're playing with and how they're playing, and then you look at a Villa side that's added some really nice pieces this window, and it seems to starting to get this thing back on the rails. Um, I I can't imagine either one of them stay there. I think if I'm picking one to drop, I'm probably picking over the duration. I think City can probably pick up more points than Chelsea.
Yeah, I feel like they've picked up enough key players and they've played a lot of big matches already in January and early February. They get Liverpool out of the way in a little bit. They've already had their Arsenal match. So I could see them going on where they get 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 wins and a draw in there. With that, I think they will finish ahead. I still think City will probably get to third, because I do think there will be a period where Forest has a little blip. I do agree with the shout. I've said it before, and we'll talk a lot about it tonight on our podcast, which is why I skipped over it today. I mean, I've been talking about Bournemouth since October. Everyone else is just coming to the Bournemouth is the toughest side. I must have heard 50 times in the last 3 days how Liverpool just played their toughest match remaining on the schedule. And I love it because, they have to travel to City and they have Arsenal at home, and Bournemouth away was the toughest match, but it was a really grind. And I just think they give everybody a match, and they cause every single side, probably in all of Europe, problems with the way that they play. And they press so aggressively, and their team is so young. So I really like that Bournemouth side. I almost feel like the best thing for Bournemouth, though, is finishing sixth and getting into the Europa League and learning how to play European football and not going straight into Champions League knockout rounds. Um, Not being able to probably strengthen in 1 year. Like, if you get into Europa, you might lose a player or two, but you might be able to convince a couple. I think if you get in Champions League, it could be like a one and done type of Newcastle season, and it may not be the best thing in the world. Plus, I'm really just in my heart of hearts rooting for City to finish fifth, and then Spurs to go Spurs and win and go opposite Spurs and win the Europa League. So they kick City's fifth place out of Champions League and they have to go play in the Europa League. Like, how great would it be for City and those players to maybe be playing in the championship and also have to spend midweeks traveling out to like the most random ass place in all of Europe, like we did on Thursday afternoons, where you had to get an almanac out so you could figure out where the fuck they were playing today. Like, what country is Liverpool traveling to today? Because I don't even know how to pronounce this side. Let's take a look at the bottom of the table. There's not much drama here, honestly, because with Everton's victories, I feel like we're down to just 3 from 4. I really don't believe that West Ham or Everton will get anywhere back near this relegation zone, in my opinion. There's even an argument that Wolves could string a couple results together after their victory against Villa, and this could just be done and dusted by like mid-April. Um, does Leicester or Ipswich have any hope? And do you give Southampton anything more than kudos and a slap on the back for going and getting 3 points this weekend, just purely so they dreadedly get away from that Derby record?
Yeah, sure. I think I just think this was such a bad loss for Ipswich, man. Like they had to have points here. And it's not only that, they just didn't play particularly well. Like I don't think that like the way they played for Southampton, I didn't think they played that poorly throughout, even though the results haven't been there, right? Like they've given some teams some matches and some issues, but it's just a really like that was the one spot in all of the fixtures that you had to have three, and you went in and you laid an egg. You started nicely and laid an egg, and that was just, yeah, it's a bad loss. I don't see any of those teams. I think that's it. I think it's nailed in. I think this weekend for me solidified that bottom three.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I got to tell you, if I'm Kieran McKenna, I'm wondering to myself, like, can I get last summer back? Can I take that phone call where United asked if I wanted to come in and interview for the job, and I told them no thanks because I'm going to see through my first season at Ipswich, and I understand he didn't want that shit job in that moment, and he's probably thought if I do a good job at Ipswich, I'll get an opportunity at that job eventually. Um, but to think that Manchester United wanted to talk to you and you turned it down to stay there, and you're probably going right back into the championship, and I wonder I wonder if he honestly even survives the season because at some point, don't those clubs, don't Leicester, don't Ipswich, don't they kind of have to go back into the well and at least try to break glass and see if you can find lightning in a bottle and find somebody that can give you an opportunity to get you back up? I mean, it just seems short-sighted to think to yourself, "Oh, Kieran McKenna took us 2 levels up, then got to the Premier League, proved he wasn't ready to manage in the Premier League, so we should bring him back to the Championship so he can go back to the Premier League and realize he's not ready for the Premier League." And maybe I'm just being harsh on him, but they look naive at times to the way they play. I mean, no one's dropped more points from winning positions than they have. Not just, point positions, winning positions.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they haven't even taken the opportunities that they were given. So